Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. Today, we're speaking with a cinematographer and director. Her credits include The Madison, Yellowstone, and Filthy Rich. We're pleased to welcome Christina Alexandra Voros. Christina, thank you for doing this.
Yes, great to see you.
It's such an honor to be here.
We'd love to start with our normal first question, which is, how did you get to where you are today? Is this something you always thought you wanted to do? Did you take pictures as a kid, or did you go in a different direction and then find this later? What's your story?
It's a very circuitous story. I still am scratching my head as to exactly how I got here. As a kid, I grew up knowing I wanted to be an artist. My mom was an artist. My dad was an avid reader and lover of films. And my first love was painting and theater. As a kid through high school, I was convinced I wanted to be an actor when I grew up. And when I graduated college, I studied English in college and spent all of my free time acting in theater productions. And I decided to apply to graduate school for theater, much to my parents' chagrin. And in the process of doing that, a friend of mine suggested I apply to film school. And I thought it was ludicrous. There had been a film department at my university, and I had no interest. I had no inclination. I certainly never thought myself capable of being a director, even in the theater, but I knew that I loved to tell stories. And so I found myself, I applied to NYU Film, partially because the application was kind of fun. It asked for, I assumed to go to film school, you had to have done film, which turns out is not the case at all. And so the application allowed you to submit a writing sample of visual art portfolio, my resume as an actor. And I thought to myself at the time, oh, this would be a great place just to get all of my creative stuff in one place and take stock of where I am as an artist and what I want to do next. And so I applied to NYU, and I never thought I'd get in. And I applied to a graduate theater program in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and through the American Repertory Theater, which I had always wanted to go to. It was a 2-year program where you did your first year in Cambridge and your second year at the Moscow Art Theater School. And that had been my dream. And so I applied, I got in, I sent them my deposit, and then I got a call from NYU asking me to come in for an interview. And I thought, why not? I'll just go. And it was somewhat traumatizing. I remember leaving that interview in tears, thinking, what was I thinking even? I know nothing about this discipline. What am I even doing here?
Can I stop you a minute? Can I just ask you, what was in your submission to get you to that point of an interview?
I submitted a series of writing samples. I submitted a fairly substantial visual art portfolio. I'd been doing a lot of painting and textile art, and I submitted my theater resume, which was, fairly substantial for, being 22 years old. But I never thought I'd make it as far as the interview. I really had no aspirations to, I don't think I'd ever thought what would happen if I got in. It was that out there. And 2 weeks after leaving the interview in tears, I got a call from NYU, not only telling me I was accepted, but offering me a scholarship. And it was so random that it forced me to pause for a moment to see if the universe was trying to open a door for me that I didn't know existed. And so I called the American Repertory Theater. I thanked them. I asked to defer for a year. I think I said, I will certainly be back. I was so convinced that this was something I needed to explore because the door had opened, but I didn't really think I would continue down that path. But I was just curious enough that I needed to see what was behind that curtain. And so I moved to New York to go to film school. I could not, even with the scholarship, I could not afford an apartment in New York. And I had these 2 absolutely amazing great aunts who were Hungarian, but both my parents are Hungarian. They immigrated to the States in 1956. And my great aunts, Vali and Mimi, had been costume designers for the opera and the circus in Budapest. And then when they moved to the States in 56, opened up a couture shop on Lexington Avenue and had been making these beautiful gowns for a certain set of fancy ladies in the Upper East Side social circles. And I'd kind of grown up underfoot in their studio and collecting sequins and fittings. And when I got older, one of my favorite things to do in the world was they would send me down to the garment district to run errands for them and have me pick up lining and zippers. And, so I grew up very much ensconced in a family of creative people. My other great aunt was an opera singer. My mom is an incredible piano player. So I'd grown up around a very, very creative energy. And so when I got into film school, Volley said, well, you can come sleep on our couch. And so I moved into their apartment. I slept on their couch. They were 92 and 95 when I started film school. And they really made it possible. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. And, one of the first projects you do at NYU in your first year is you do a 10-minute documentary film. And I remember a lot of my classmates kind of guffawing about it because they were there to become the next Spielberg and they didn't want to waste their time in documentary, and that's not what they'd set out to do, and they were very frustrated by it. I, on the other hand, I came to film school a total technophobe with no experience in photography, no experience in directing, a very healthy fear of math. And so everything technical about film school sort of terrified me. I felt very out of my depth. My first semester at film school, I was convinced I would break the camera or crash the Final Cut on the computer. I was very out of my comfort zone. And so I was living with my great aunts. I took out a loan to buy what was at the time a very high-end prosumer mini DV camera. I think it was a Canon XL2. And I took out a loan to buy this camera because I was so sort of subtly embarrassed by my lack of knowledge that I wanted to figure some of this stuff out, not under the eyes of my lovely and very kind and supportive, but slightly judgmental classmates. And so I started filming my great aunts, and that became my documentary for my first year. And that film, it's about 12 minutes long. It's probably still my favorite thing that I've ever done. And it's a very Eastern Bloc Grey Gardens tone poem about these two creative women in the twilight of their lives reflecting on what it means to be an artist. And that was my first film. And that was sort of the thing that opened up every door that was to follow. I had some remarkable teachers at NYU, and Spike Lee was one of them. And when I showed him that film, I remember him saying to me, where on earth did you find these women? And I said, well, I live with them. And so that first short film opened up doors for me in doing documentary, but also, there was this moment, late 90s, early 2000s, where handheld, shooting handheld was very chic, right? And so there was a lot of crossover between documentary, photography, and this handheld language. And so I started being asked by classmates of mine to shoot their narrative films. And keep in mind, I came to film school. I didn't know I had to look up what a cinematographer was when I got into NYU. And ironically, because I'm Hungarian, I don't know I must have Googled Hungarian cinematographer. And I came across the website of a remarkable Hungarian cinematographer named Mátyás Erdei. And his website was just dop.hu. And I had to look up what DOP was because I didn't know that meant. I mean, I was aware of cinematography as a concept because it was always that Oscar where I never recognized someone. It was always a very a composed, elegant gentleman that I had never seen before holding the golden trophy. And in my childhood, I have reflections of that moment in the Oscars back when, I had no idea I was going into film. But I never expected I would become one. And so once I started shooting documentary and realized I kind of loved the dance of operating a camera and I wanted to know more about it, I really doubled down on everything I didn't know. And I had a wonderful cinematography professor named Tony Ginelli, and I walked into his office and I said, can I come be a teaching assistant in your second and third year classes? Because I just want to steep myself. There's so much I don't know. And I want to know if I'm even smart enough to know it. Because it's funny. I think a great deal about the fact that if I had come to filmmaking 20 years earlier, if I'd been born 20 years earlier, I don't think I ever would have become a cinematographer, because there's something that's happened technologically that has allowed someone who is not necessarily interested in the I shouldn't say interested, who's not as keen or proficient in the math and the science of it. To be a DP 20 years ago, you could not separate those things. You had to understand whether it's metering or emulsions. You had to understand the photochemistry of it in a way that could not be divorced from the process of visual storytelling. You just weren't allowed the opportunity to do it without knowing that. It was part of the package. And when I was coming out of NYU, my year was the first year that didn't learn how to cut on a Steenbeck. We were still shooting on film, but it was transitioning. It was the early era of HD, when you could get like a 4 gigabyte card and record 2 minutes at a time. And so I discovered cinematography at a very unique moment where the world opened itself up to me in a way where my fear of math and my creative impulses leaning more towards the artistry, I was not at a deficit. And so I learned to shoot film. I studied under Sandy Sissel as well at NYU. I loved shooting on film, but I could experiment in digital in a way that really allowed me to teach myself things that I would not have had the opportunity to do if it was, a generation earlier. And so I had graduated NYU as a cinematographer and a director. I did a lot of documentary work right out of the gate. I spent a lot of time in India working on projects there. I spent a lot of time in Kenya and in Mozambique. I traveled a great deal, and I was doing narrative work and working on short films for friends, and had hit this wall where I couldn't get my first feature. I really wanted to do a feature, but I had never done one.
Can I just ask you,
Yeah.
when you left NYU, I mean, how did you get that work in documentaries? Was that all people you'd met at the film school, or how?
It was sort of a mixed bag. It was people I'd met in film school. It was people who would reach out to the university and say, I'm looking for a student filmmaker to help me film my no-budget film somewhere. My first trip to India came about that way. It was a director who had not directed anything before. He was a professor at Columbia, and he was looking for somebody who wanted to go to India to work on this project with him. I had a professor of mine at NYU who hired me to shoot a documentary he was directing on the music of the civil rights movement. I don't really know. I was always sort of scanning the internet for people on Mandy.com looking for someone to shoot for $100 a day. I would shoot whatever I could get my hands on because I was constantly learning. And I loved, documentary was really my first love. In film school, I really discovered, I went deep diving into sort of the history of the art form and fell in love with the work of the Maisel brothers and really believed in cinema verite. And I also love immersing myself in anything that I do. So getting to tell a story where you are lucky enough to be welcomed into somebody's life, to be so close to their world and creating that trust and being honored with the opportunity to tell their story. There was something very holistic about it from a storytelling perspective that I adored. And it's interesting because I feel like so much of what I learned doing documentary work inflects the work that I do now on a daily basis, both in terms of constantly looking for where the story might go, in looking for opportunities that might not be planned for, in trusting. I mean, the thing with documentary is you always have to have a plan going in, but you also have to be confident in recognizing that everything you thought might be wrong once you get to a certain point in the story. You have to be comfortable with releasing expectation. And because there are films where people set out to make a documentary about one thing, and then 2 months into it go, oh, it's not this at all. That's not the story. You have to trust the path to open up and present itself to you. And I carry that with me in my work every day, even if I'm working in scripted television, that you may think something is going to be one way on the page, and then you put two actors in a room and they say the words for a first time, you go, oh no, this is something completely different. And if you are so convinced that your first plan is right, you may miss a tremendous opportunity to tell something that is more true. And so I think that early work for me in documentary is something that, it's so funny. I think back to the classmates who thought it was a total waste of time that first year of film school. And I couldn't disagree more.
So how did you get your first jobs in narrative?
I had done a couple of short films, sort of referrals through friends and people who had some kind of paltry thesis film budget. And then after I had graduated from NYU, one of my mentors there was a directing professor named Jay Anania, and he called me and he said, I have this student, he's an actor, he's looking for, an alumni to kind of come on board to help sort of supervise his student projects. And I said, sure, are they paying? So I was broke at the time, and said, yeah. And so I got a phone call from a young producer who said, I'm working with James Franco, and he's looking for someone to sort of be a supervising producer on his film projects. And I had no idea who that was. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I was not familiar with him as an actor. So I ended up starting to work with James, I guess it was 2009 maybe, and I was sort of like a expert on sets, for all things from what not to do when loading 16 millimeter film to helping with permitting things. And then I started to shoot for him, and I shot a couple of his later projects. And my first feature film was it was his thesis film at NYU. It was an adaptation of a book based on the life of the poet Hart Crane. It's called The Broken Tower. And he wanted to shoot it black and white, and we shot it on Canon 5Ds, and he starred in it, and Michael Shannon was in it as well. And we shot with almost no budget, but we shot in Brooklyn and in Paris and in Veracruz on these teeny tiny cameras.
Wow.
And, no one, I had gone up for features previously, and I had made it down to like the last three people, but it always came down to the fact that I'd never shot a feature before. And, it's something that I've come up against a lot in my career is, well, there's you and we really like you, and here's this other person and they have more experience. And so James took a chance on me, and we did that small film together. And then we did four more features together, or four total. We did a film called Sal, which was, I think, a 23-page script that ended up as a feature film. And then we did a film called Child of God that we shot in West Virginia. And then we did As I Lay Dying, which is a adaptation of the famous Faulkner book that had historically been thought to be unadaptable into film by virtue of how it was written.
Also Child of God,
Child of God, Cormac McCarthy.
Book. I mean, it was kind of pretty hard adaptation, really.
I mean, James, to his credit, I almost think there's some part of his brain that would go, let's find something nobody says is possible, and let's try and do that with as few resources as we can muster. And there's a tremendous amount of creativity that comes out of those sorts of limitations. I'm very proud of the films that we did, as obscure as the source material might be in some places, as, unshootable as other projects were thought to be. I'm really proud of the sort of scrappy intrepidness that we all had when we were making those films together. And As I Lay Dying was a turning point for me in many ways, it was the first film that I'd done that worked with animals, larger animals, which obviously has become something that I do all the time now. It was a film I met my husband on. He was an animal wrangler on that show because we had a lot of blind driving with a team of mules. And I also had the opportunity to work with Tim Blake Nelson, who's an actor that I've always adored and who I've since gone on to collaborate with. I shot a film for him called Anesthesia. So
Right.
As I Lay Dying
yeah.
was this, in hindsight, was this seed that many things grew out of.
Wow. How did you work on those movies? I mean, we've seen some of them. Were you operating yourself? How big a crew was it? I mean, how did you do, especially Anesthesia in New York with Tim? I mean, there's some kind of more complicated locations than maybe you had been doing with James on his film.
Yeah, with James, we were usually out in the middle of nowhere. So there's a lot of freedom in that. And our crews on James's shows were very small. I mean, I think maybe we had, 3 grips or 4 grips, 3 electricians. I mean, it was very small. I was always operating myself. I think both Child of God and As I Lay Dying were 2 cameras. And so you're always trusting in your other operator, hopefully is getting what you want because you can't see it. And then Tim's movie, Anesthesia was a little bit more robust in terms of budget and in terms of infrastructure. Our producer on that, Julie Buck, was really wonderful at finding a way to squeeze everything you could out of a location or a vendor, or we had a really wonderful production team on the ground in New York for that. But it was much more. It was ambitious in a different sort of way because there were so many locations, there were so many storylines that it was a very different beast than James's shows.
And how much of these films were preconceived with storyboards, and how much was like
On the day.
on the day, instinctive reactions to what actors are doing or whatever?
There are a lot of conversations in both places. James and I, we worked together so much on so many things that there was a real shorthand. And we watched a lot of films in prep to kind of imbue our approach to the shows, to the films that it's interesting. We'd sort of soak in it during prep and then completely let it go. And what made sense in the moment carried through. And I remember a moment where we were watching something we'd done together, and he was like, "Oh, remember that was in relation? Remember we watched all those movies by the Dardenne brothers, and look, it's just like that, And so it's interesting. I think for me, my prep process is very much to marinate very deeply in something, and then when we start shooting, to kind of let that all go and trust that what is important has stayed in the creative thought process, and what doesn't apply, you let go of. Not dissimilar to, what I think documentary has taught me. Tim is one of the most brilliantly hyper-intellectual human beings I've ever met. He is probably
He's certainly hyper.
he's wildly well-read. I mean, that you could say that about both of them, and is very, very specific. James was often, especially because James would be acting in what he was doing, he would trust me to find the frames. He would occasionally have ideas about a specific camera approach to a specific moment, but in general, there was a lot of trust in terms of my capturing the images. Tim would sometimes say, well, what if we put a 50 mil lens down here and then boom up about 12 inches? Like, he was a little bit more specific in certain moments, but also, I think the first time you're working with a director, there's a lot that kind of congeals in the first couple of days, couple of weeks of a film. And then once you get into a synergy, there are fewer and fewer conversations that need to be had.
Yeah.
I'm asked a lot about what my working process is with Taylor Sheridan, and we don't talk about things as much as people think we would, because we've done so much together, and there's such a shorthand and intuitiveness in how we are approaching the story that there aren't as many discrete conversations about specific approaches to a given scene or a given look. We check in about sort of things that he has a very precise idea about, but for the most part, there's so much that has been built on our history of telling stories together that fewer conversations need to be had.
Well, tell us, how did you meet up with Taylor? I mean, you shot a number of films before you started to make your move into doing TV series work. Can you talk about that process, how that evolved? What drew you to it as well?
It's funny. I had been shooting in the independent film space for a number of years, and I had started to be really intrigued by the kind of storytelling that was going on in long form television. And I had an agent who was not particularly supportive of my idea of branching outside of my very comfortable lane of small independent films that went to big festivals and didn't really get seen after that. So I left my agent and had a really hard time finding another one. And my stepson at the time had just gotten into a car accident. He's fine, thank God. But at the time, it was a really scary moment. And I was unemployed and living in West Texas, which is where my husband's from, and I didn't have an agent and the phone wasn't ringing. And I started reaching out to everyone I'd ever worked with looking for work. And I had a friend of mine who was a first AD who called me and said, I'm applying for this job on this Taylor Sheridan show, and it's all about cowboys and horses. And does Jason know about it? Because he should get a job as a wrangler. It's a big animal show. And I was obviously very familiar with Taylor Sheridan as a screenwriter. I looked up the project and I saw that Ben Richardson was the cinematographer on the first season of Yellowstone. And Ben and I had known each other in New York, had a lot of friends in common, and we hadn't spoken in years, but I sent him an email saying, I know you think of me as a DP and maybe not an operator, but I would love to come operate for you on this show. And I'd never been an operator for anyone other than myself before. And so I don't really even know, I don't think I knew what I was asking at the time. And I didn't hear back from him immediately. And in the meantime, I had been on a film festival jury a year earlier with Ava DuVernay, and she called me up out of nowhere and said, I have this show called Queen Sugar that I'm doing with Oprah, and I'd love you to come in and do one episode. And I said, that's amazing. I'd be honored. Who's the lead DP? And she said, no, I don't want you to DP. I want you to come and direct. And it was such an odd turn of events because I think she saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. And she had created the show with Oprah to be an incubator for female filmmakers who had not been given an opportunity to work in the TV space. And so she brought me in to direct an episode of that. And on the last day that we were shooting in New Orleans, I got a phone call from Ben Richardson saying, hey, can you be on a plane to Utah in 2 weeks? I need a B camera operator on Yellowstone. And so I went to Utah and I spent the first 2 weeks convinced I was going to get fired. I had never worked on anything that big, or at least not in a capacity that was so integral to the actual filmmaking process. My first time on a big set was I got to be a camera PA on 127 Hours, which was a dream come true because Anthony Dodmantle is somebody that I had always admired greatly, and I found a tremendous amount in the way he came into storytelling and the sort of crafty intrepidness of how he approached working with minimalistically and maximalistically. He was a really early hero to me. So 127 had been my first time on a big set, but not as a key player. So when I got to Yellowstone, I don't know, I was trying to figure out how to put myself into the different energetic space of being an operator as opposed to a DP. And it was a massive learning experience for me. I found myself wishing I'd been an operator sooner. There's something incredibly zen about you show up, you make beautiful pictures, you are focused, you are telling a story without having to worry about the politics or the post or the prep. It's just so, you're so in the moment. There's something I really loved about that. And about 3 months into the show, I had a little bit of crisis of conscience. And I called a mentor of mine. I said, have I taken a step backwards? Because I'd been a DP and now I'm an operator and I'm not hands-on and the creative choices. And was this all a terrible mistake? And she said, are you learning something every day? And I said, yes. And she's like, and is it making you a better storyteller? I said, yes. She's like, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And it was such sound advice. And at the end of that first season, Ben had made the decision to step away for season 2, and he and Taylor asked me if I wanted to come on to be the DP on season 2. And so I'm very glad that I trusted whatever energetic path I was on, even if it felt like it was zigging and zagging, it was still moving forward. And I think it's something that's been a pattern in my life, that my career has not been traditional in any sense of the way. I think there are a lot of people who work in film and television who could say the same thing, but I didn't wake up one morning and say, this is what I want to do, and this is my game plan, and these are the boxes I'm going to check, and that's how I'm going to get there. It wasn't that at all. I have really been led by relationships and artists who see something in me or I see something in them, and trusting that. That's what led me to Taylor. That's, the experiences I've had along the way. I mean, before working with Taylor Sheridan, I was working very closely with the director Tate Taylor. We did 2 movies together and a TV series, Filthy Rich. And ironically, that relationship also came about from being on a film festival jury with Stephen Goldblatt. And we were
Wow.
we were at a film festival in Mexico, and he had done several projects with Tate and wasn't available to do this smaller horror movie called Ma, and suggested me to Tate, and we met. And so I feel like I've been very open to where my creative angels might come from, and they have sort of my career is sort of a constellation of these different creative relationships that have kind of handed off from one to another to lead me to where I am.
So on Filthy Rich, you shot a lot of them, but you also directed an episode, right? And how did that come about that you got to direct? Because you didn't shoot that particular episode, did you?
I can't recall. I know that my colleague Mike Perry came on to be the other the other DP on that season. But to be honest with you, I don't remember if I shot it myself or if he did. I've been shooting my own work for such a long time now that it's the trajectory is a little bit murky. I came to, Tate and I did Ma together, and then when he decided to do Filthy Rich, he asked me to join. And as they were looking for other directors for that season, my name came up in conversation. And because I had directed previously for Ava, he decided to take a gamble on me. Ironically, I knew I was doing Filthy Rich as a director, but I ended up directing on Yellowstone before that, because I had been a cinematographer season 2, then season 3, I had stepped away to go do a movie with Tate, and a directing block opened up on Yellowstone that season. And so I finished shooting a movie for Tate called Breaking News in Yuba County, went to Utah, directed 2 episodes of Yellowstone, and then came back and did Filthy Rich with Tate.
So what led to the choice to direct and shoot?
And how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's funny. I remember being in film school and asking a professor, do people ever shoot and direct at the same time? And the answer then was not really, unless you're working in advertising, that it's not really a thing, and for a good reason, because they are 2 discretely unique, very labor intensive jobs, which I still maintain is true. What happened was season 3 of Yellowstone, I directed, but I didn't shoot my work. And season 4, Taylor, I think he might have just said, look, you've directed and you've shot. Do you just want to shoot your own episodes? And I said, I'll give it a shot. I was sort of, I think in the moment, I was just so amazed that this opportunity had opened itself up for me that I kind of dreamed of, but didn't know was really a thing. And so I was a little bit charmed by the challenge of it, and wasn't really sure if it was possible, wasn't really sure it would work, but realized there was only one way to find out. And so season 4 of Yellowstone, I DP'd a couple of blocks for other directors, and then I shot my own block. And it was a very unique experience, because at that point, the crew on that show had been working together for 4 years. They were all friends. We had all been steeped in the language of the show and the style of the show. The cast members were like family. And so it was only due to the tremendous synergy between myself and the crew and the cast and the crew that it was possible, right? Because so much was known collectively about what the look of the show was, how we approach certain things, what you do when you're filming 200 horses cascading down a mountain. Like there was such a deep collective knowledge as to how to make the thing that weirdly it felt wildly efficient because I didn't have to say out loud to somebody else the thing that I wanted from the people who knew me. I could just say it to them. And so, the crew that we've been working with for a very long time, if they were not who they were, and if they were not the technicians that they were, and if we were not the friends that we were, it wouldn't have been possible. And so that first season, it kind of felt exhilarating to be able to do it. But I also realized that it was a very rare dynamic that had to exist to make it functional. And we finished we finished that fourth season of Yellowstone, and the next thing we did was 1883, and we got to 1883, and Taylor said, "So you're shooting your own episode, right?" And I was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa! This is a completely different animal. This is a huge period piece. It's a new look. It's a new show." And I remember him saying, "Well, look, why don't you just try it? And then if it doesn't work, you can bring in a DP for the second block." And I remember thinking, this is crazy. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if it's smart to do this. I don't know if it's responsible to do this. But again, a lot of the crew was the family that had come over from Yellowstone. And it was a very different show and in many ways a very different look, but the philosophy of camera language was the same. And it worked. I think it can only work if you have enough prep time, if you can lean on your relationship to a crew of technicians that is absolutely at the top of their game. I mean, what we do to our first ACs on, a 400 mil lens on a doubler chasing a horse across a field is almost inhumane. Our teams are so good at what they do.
Also, isn't it the fact that television has a slightly different structure? So you have that showrunner who's another person that's looking at everything overall and knows the series as well as you do as a director. So isn't it different slightly if it's
I do think it is. I mean, you're not individually responsible for inventing the wheel, right? There is a recipe that you are involved in creating, but it is not singularly your responsibility. And I think one of the things that's beautiful to me about 1883 is Taylor directed on that, Ben directed on that, I directed on that. Ben shot for himself as well. I remember he was not planning to in the beginning, and then I just decided what the hell she's doing it. I don't know. We both just decided to do it. And if it didn't work, we'd figure something better out for the next block. And it worked. And what I love about that show is I really don't think you can tell the difference between episodes Taylor did, episodes Ben did, and episodes I did in terms of the cinematography or in terms of the directing. It is such a singular language, which I think is remarkable for a show of that length and that scope. And it was really born out of a collective. I mean, it's something, I think about a lot as a cinematographer and as a director. I've never been someone who came to the form determined to make a name for myself as a certain thing. I've never been into storytelling for the sake of the credit, for the sake of the brand, for the sake of, the attention. I've never told stories from a place of, I have a way of telling stories that's different than anybody else's, and therefore I've never had an auteur mentality about things. I try to let the story teach me how to shoot it. I try to let performances teach me how to shoot them. And it's not that there isn't a significant amount of planning and thought and research that goes into a project. But once I've done that research, I really try to allow the project to teach me what it wants to be. And it's something that I think has served me well. I mean, 1883 was very different from Yellowstone, was very different from Bass Reeves, and they were all very different from the Madison. The Madison is the first thing that I've ever had the opportunity to take ownership of in the way of directing so many episodes. But even that is not for me. It's, I don't know. There's a certain absence of ego in it for me that I think has served me well as a storyteller. I approach every project as much in the present as I can, and I am grateful every day that I get an opportunity to do this.
Can I ask you? I want to go back. I thought I was really interested in what you were saying. You were starting out, and the way technology has changed.
We are going back.
In terms of cinematography. I mean, I feel this very much that the way some people can capture images now is totally different when I started out on film, or in the 50s when James Wong Howe was producing his wonderful kind of personal, very dramatic visuals on a story. Do you think that the technology has helped you as a director cinematographer? I mean, how much does lighting really impinge on what you're doing? How much can you do in post? How much flexibility have you nowadays that it's not this big technical challenge? I mean, if you look at behind the scenes footage of or images of something like HUD that James Wong Howe was shooting, to do a tracking shot of two people crossing a street, I mean, there's a huge amount of gear with brute art shooting.
Huge cameras.
I mean, huge cameras and limited shooting time. I mean, just that whole change in technology must have been a huge advantage for somebody like you doing what you do.
Well, I think the first advantage it gave me was the opportunities to experiment, just with the act of committing an image to a frame, right? People make movies on their iPhones. That is a blessing and a curse, right? Because the problem that for me, the problem with technology, and I always try to stay conscious of it. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, right? And I think that there's so much freedom that you almost have to create your own boundaries, and whether that's project to project or as a philosophy in your career. Perfect example. I sort of dream of shooting a one camera film, right? I haven't had the opportunity to work in a cadence that celebrates that form, but it's a completely different philosophy. It's a completely different approach. It is something I miss about film school, right? Where you are forced to work with such an efficiency just by virtue of the resources, be it time, money, film stock, that you have to be really thoughtful about what you're doing. You can't figure it out later. And I remember when we were studying editing, right on the sort of cusp of Steenbeck's to Final Cut Pro, my editing professor, was a mentor of mine, Carol Deisinger, said, the problem with nonlinear editing is now you can edit faster than you can think.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And you're not committed to it because it's so easy to undo. And so you're delaying the process of making decisions, whether it's as a director or as a cinematographer, as opposed to having to make those decisions sooner. I think working in the television space and working with multiple cameras, I've approached it kind of like a different dance. It's like jazz as opposed to classical music, right? There are things that it allows you that are tremendous. And if you lean into those things, the work will be elevated. If you are using 5 cameras just to have 5 different random angles on something so you have something to cut to, that's going to dilute what the end product is. And it's very easy to get lazy. I work with multiple cameras often. I mean, on the Madison, when we were doing our Montana work, we had 5 cameras the entire time we were in Montana. And there's a very specific strategy that is always kind of playing underneath the thought process that's at the top of my brain, which is, sometimes there are 5 good viable angles, right? When you're doing an ensemble piece of 7 people talking in a field and you have all the space in the world and you're shooting on long lenses because it's part of the language of the film, it's a great opportunity to allow people's performances to really play off of each other and to be able to, you're ostensibly cross-covering a six-handed conversation. And what that allows the actors energetically often results in performance that you would not necessarily get if you were doing this person's coverage and this person's coverage and this person's coverage. So as someone whose first love was acting, the freedom that shooting multiple cameras when you can do it well allows the performance. And as a director, what it allows you in terms of getting variations that are, it's not just one person adjusting, it's the entire ensemble adjusting, is an excellent use of 5 cameras as far as I'm concerned. There are definitely moments in the day where I go, I don't know, even if I tried, I wouldn't know where to put another camera. Sometimes what I do and it's really almost vibe management on set. If I have 5 camera operators and there's a setup and there's nothing for that other person to do, sometimes I'll say, go see if you can find an eagle in the sky on this shot. Or, you know what, put on a long lens, go fish. Just maybe you'll find something magical. But that's done entirely for, I know even in my limited experience being a camera operator, I have a very hard time when stopping and starting and stopping and starting. And so when you have 5 people working together telling a story behind cameras, to suddenly take someone out of the game for 2 hours when there might be something that they could find that's miraculous if you leave it up to them, it does something energetically to the group, right? Being sidelined from the process of storytelling, it has a very subtle effect. And so because what we're doing is so specifically designed to be not just a multi-camera show, but a 5-camera show. It's absurd. We're making a family story with 5 cameras. I wouldn't have thought that possible. It's a different philosophy, the way I approach it, not only in terms of what we're committing to the screen, but also in terms of the holistic energy on set, which is very important to me as a director and as a cinematographer. And I think it's important to the cast. And part of the reason MADISON is so remarkable, I think, is because these performances have been allowed to be captured in a very organic way. And there is such a closeness and a family atmosphere on the set between crew and cast that everyone feels very safe and everyone feels very protected. And there's a subliminal something I can't put my finger on about the work that I think comes out of an environment where people all feel so supported.
It does lead to the question. I mean, I've certainly worked on films where one actor or actress have actually said to the director, you get 2 takes and that's it. I can't do any more. Whereas the other person in the same conversation will say, well, I don't really get anywhere till after take 12. I mean, this has happened on a couple of sets I've been on. And so it demands you cast certain actors that are comfortable in that kind of space, right? That's a different way of actually performing in front of 5 cameras. It's different than actually a director concentrating on one shot on that one actor's performance if you're in close-ups. You know what I mean? It seems very different.
Absolutely. I mean, Taylor seems to be one of his secret powers, as far as I'm concerned, is in casting. He has a wonderful ability to, in some cases, I think he's writing with specific actors in mind, but his ability to find exactly the right temperature, volume, nuance in, even if it's a day player, he's very, very good at it. And I think that at this point, there are enough of his shows in the world. There are enough actors who've worked on them. Actors talk to each other. I think there's a track record of how Taylor shows work that people have cross-referenced with each other. I mean, Michelle said doing press for MADISON, that she called Helen Mirren to ask her what her experience was like on 1923. So
Right.
I think the much in the vein of finding the artists that align with your ability or your desired creative energies. I think Taylor tends to find that he attracts the right actors for the shows. And I've been, we shoot a lot of coverage. When you're shooting 7 people talking at a dinner table, there are 7 people who need to be talking at the dinner table. There's a lot of coverage. And I have never had an experience on Taylor's shows of someone being less than generous with their responsibility to their fellow cast members. I think that's one thing. There's another side of that, which is there are actors who are wonderful out at the gate, and there are actors who need several takes to kind of get in the zone. Sometimes the same actor can feel differently from day to day, depending on what the material is. Michelle and I would talk a lot about, I would say, gee, you feel like we'd rehearse. It's like, okay, it feels like you're right there. Do you want us to start with the close-ups? And then we can work our way out. And then some days it takes you have 7 people talking, and it takes a moment or two for everyone to kind of land the cadence of the scene. And so then I'll start wider and I'll work in tighter. I always try to allow the performance to direct the strategy with which I approach a scene. And that can change from day to day, from actor to actor.
Well, how are you actually directing then? You're not operating, I presume?
No.
You're watching monitors. So have you got 5 monitors that you're sitting in front of?
I do. I feel like my brain is. I'm very conscious of the fact that I feel like my brain is being slightly rewired. I'm ADHD, so I've always been someone who's better at cycling through multiple things than just focusing on one thing. Maybe that lends itself to my current position of directing, producing, and shooting on a show. But it is, you can't really look at 5 monitors. There's just no way to be paying attention. I have been blessed with really remarkable script supervisors. And sometimes I'll say, okay, I'm going to take A, B, and C camera. Will you just look at these 2? But it's strange. My brain does something weird now where I arrange my monitors so it's 3 on top, 2 on the bottom. And so I can kind of scan them in a circle as opposed to keeping them far away from each other. And it's almost like I'm cutting it in my brain. It's kind of like the people who, call out like live sports shows,
Live
like
switching.
go camera 6,
Yeah, right.
But I'm kind of cutting it as I'm seeing it all in front of me. And it's strange. I'm starting a new show next week called Frisco King that Taylor wrote with Samuel L. Jackson. And I'm working with a DP for the pilot because I just came off of, we did the second season of Madison, and then I did the finale for Dutton Ranch, and then we're rolling into Frisco King right now. And so Taylor had said, well, you'll shoot it. And I said, no, this is where it becomes irresponsible. I don't have enough prep time to do both of those things well. So I'm working with a DP named Stuart Campbell, who's doing the pilot with me, and then I'll shoot my own episodes for the rest of the series. But it's important to me. I cannot overstate how what I do directing and shooting at the same time is only possible by virtue of this sort of safety net of individuals that are doing it with me, whether that's the script supervisor, whether it's my gaffer and key grip. I mean, John Gorman and Craig Sullivan that I've worked with for years on Yellowstone and then on the Madison, they can read many minds. Our camera team has been working with me for a really long time. Our focus pullers have been working with me for a really long time. So the synergy that comes from having that shorthand is really the only thing that makes it possible. I would never go into somebody else's house, into a different studio, on a completely different show with people I didn't know and endeavor to do it that way. When we set up to do Dutton Ranch at the beginning of the season, we were shooting in Texas and we needed to commit to local Texas crew. And so in that case, I was working with a gaffer, a key grip, and a camera team that I mostly had not worked with before, but we had a lot of prep to get in sync and to get on the same page before we jumped into production.
And what about, for instance, in the Madison? Do you even have time to go into the cutting room? Is it cut along while you're shooting? How is that dealt with?
Madison is unique, I think, in its post-process because Chad Galster cut all the episodes. He's been cutting for Taylor from the very beginning. I have never met an editor who cuts my work more flawlessly than Chad does. There is a deep understanding of my intent with what frames are. It's wild. I mean, I would love to say we spend hours puzzling over what exactly the right moment to go to something is, and it's not. It is the post process with Chad specifically is so seamless that he does a better job putting an assembly together than I would. And I was a documentarian. I edited for a long time. He finds things that I might have forgotten I meant, and it's not necessarily, we don't always do it in cadence with shooting. I think we finished shooting Madison and had another editor sort of putting assemblies together along the way, knowing that Chad was going to dig into it. And because of his availability, he wasn't available until we were done with the completed project. And I think Chad deserves a tremendous amount of credit in terms of the visual poetry of the episode, because so much of that emotional language that is felt in, what otherwise would just be considered B-roll was very much his artistry. I'm not someone who tends to embrace cross dissolves as an editorial language, and Chad made me actually love cross dissolves again. The way he does it in this show looks very intentional and designed, and it's not. He's just he has found something organic in places and added his own poetry to it, and it's been sort of a dream collaboration all around.
Okay, I have to ask. I mean, it's always, yeah, it's been a thing for me, multi cameras. So I'm quite trying to understand, if you've got 5 cameras shooting people sitting around a dinner table, doesn't that compromise each shot and the kind of light that you can use? Does it make it more generic?
I think the trick to using multiple cameras is knowing when you can't, right? There are places where it's useful and there's places where it isn't. In the Madison, so much of it was outside, which, working with natural light can be forgiving and unforgiving. But I felt like there was a lot more freedom using that many cameras outside than there was inside. I think, yes, if you are committing to covering the same dinner table scene with cameras on every different character, with 5 cameras, there's something will be compromised. I think our approach generally when we were shooting interiors was we would use multiple cameras for size variations. So we would, even if there might be 7 people at the table, but we would cross cover 2 at a time, 2 different lens sizes, one closer to eyeline, one wider from eyeline. But I think the real secret to working with multiple cameras, whether it's 3 or 5, is knowing when it is not helpful and possibly detrimental to the visual storytelling. And the restraint there is what I think is having a lack of restraint there is dangerous.
How much are you doing in post? I mean, are you involved in the timing of the image and everything? And how much do you allow in that? And are you always been somebody? I mean, there's some cinematographers, Cesar for one, who does an enormous amount in a DI, and he allows
does it well,
and he does it brilliantly, and he'll shoot stills of each location and show the director that this is what he can do in post. I mean, where do you fall in that sort of?
I've been working with the same colorist, Bob Festa, since the first season of Yellowstone. And again, it goes back to his shorthand. He knows we design a lot together. He knows what I like. He knows what I don't like. He knows how that's going to change from project to project. I would say I rely significantly on work in post in certain places. I am always conscious of giving everyone as much time to do what they need to do on the day on set as possible. So if it is a function of, okay, we're ready to go, I would love to bring the light down on that back wall, but nobody's crossing in front of it, I can do that later. I will always do that later. I think there is a safety net for me in knowing that I am controlling the process from start to finish. I have never had a producer or a network executive come in and say, yeah, we'd like the moonlight a little bit more blue. I've never had, in the universe that I'm working in Taylor's world, I'm given a tremendous amount of freedom, a tremendous amount of control, and a tremendous amount of responsibility. The upside to shooting for oneself is most of the conversations, good or bad, or stressful or kind, that you would have between a director and cinematographer all take place here, and nobody else has to hear it. I've been told Video Village on my sets is incredibly chill because it's just there's a lot of talking that nobody else has to listen to. But I feel very protected in the post process, and I mean, there have been days where, there's a scene in Dutton Ranch that we shot when we were in Montana. And I mean, to say we were pushing our luck at last light would be an understatement. And it was really a Hail Mary. I said, look, we're here. We're getting called off the side of a mountain because there was a snowstorm coming in. I was like, let's just get one take. If worst case, it'll be referenced for when we try to recreate this somewhere else. And if I had to worry about network executives looking at my dailies and calling me up to fire my DP because they couldn't see anything, I might not have made that choice, right? Because it was barely there. But I thought, you know what, if Bob can pull it off, anybody can't, nobody else can except him. So we shot it and we ended up using it and it ended up working. If I was afraid of somebody coming up over me or judging me based on, someone in an office in Los Angeles looking at dailies going, oh, this DP's off her rocker, there's no. So there's a certain confidence that comes from feeling protected, not only by Taylor, but by the studio and the network, because we have such a long track record with the work. So I lean heavily on post when it helps give more on the day on set. I try to light in a way that allows actors to move somewhat freely. I mean, obviously you need marks, but especially when you're dealing with scenes with a heightened emotionality, it is kind to be able to allow people to not have to worry about being 1 inch this way or 1 inch that way. I try to, again, it goes back to my love of acting. I try to create a space for those actors to feel free whenever possible. And it's one of the upsides to shooting with long lenses, which has been kind of a benchmark on a lot of Taylor shows, is that you're not right on top of people most of the time. And so it allows for a certain lack of self-consciousness. Certainly, it's one thing if you're talking about Michelle Pfeiffer, who's been doing this, her whole career and is a master. But when you're working with younger actors who are at the beginning of their career and are just starting to find their own voice as storytellers, it's nice to be able to have a little bit of space and not feel like someone's bearing down on top of you in this emotional moment.
It does give, and I'm not saying this is a criticism, but it does give the MADISON particularly a kind of observational look, because you are shooting on long lenses. You're not putting the audience close to the characters. You don't feel that involved in many ways because you're distanced on a long lens. I think psychologically it's different.
I definitely, I think I agree completely. I think there are places in the series where we made a very concerted decision to break from that in specific moments because it breaks from that objectivity. There are a couple moments with Michelle, sort of the most kind of explosive or deep feelings of loss. We decided to break from that language. It's funny. The science of it is clear, right? If you are closer to someone while you are holding the camera, it will feel like you are closer to someone when you're watching what that camera captures. There is a kind of intimacy, though, that I do think can come from longer lens work in certain ways, where there's something about the whether it's the bokeh or the focus on a specific look or a specific gesture that is sort of captured pristinely with everything else falling away. I mean, we work a lot with shooting at lenses near wide open to maximize that. And I think there's a strange effect it has on me sometimes, where even though I know that it may feel more visceral if you're on a 50 millimeter lens close up, there's something that allows you to feel intimate in long lens work if it's done a certain way. And I think I'm always dancing with that. There's a certain language that we've sort of honed over years on Taylor's shows. He likes to say that our approach is documentary adjacent, because we are, it's the upside to shooting with multiple cameras is that you can achieve that as a goal. But I think it's because the language has been so dependent on sort of wide open lenses and longer lenses, that when you do break from that, it has more of an effect than it would if you were doing it on a regular basis.
Out of interest, how much time do you have in a schedule to do one episode? I mean, how many minutes of screen time, for instance, do you shoot a day, do you think?
I wouldn't even know how to start to quantify that. With the Madison, we shot all the exteriors of Montana, and then we shot the interiors in Texas, which was a real feat, not only for the cast, but for our script supervisor from a continuity perspective, because you see somebody walk into a house, and then the scene that happens continuously inside the house, we might pick up 2 months later on a soundstage in Texas. So we are block shooting a lot. So there's sort of not, and we tend to shoot more of a page count when we're on stage than we do when we're, on location in Montana. It really varies. I mean, we have a fairly luxurious, amount of time based on television standards. There are 4-page days, there are 3.5-page days, but there are also 7-page days. And so it varies a great deal depending on what the content is, how many people are in that scene. The Madison was sort of the biggest ensemble project I'd ever worked on. So, you get a 7-page dinner scene with 8 people at the table, and you're in that for a day and a half. So
True. The old dinner scenes.
The old dinner scenes, yeah. I'm just interested because you wrote in your submission to Tish, you submitted some writing. You ever written since? Are you thinking of writing as well? Will we see your own projects, your own?
I've always written. I've written a few screenplays that one of which that it's on the to-do list. I've always written poetry. I actually just joined the WGA because I was brought on to be an additional writer on the Dutton Ranch that's coming out this year. So I don't have the discipline to be a writer. I write when I'm inspired, and it will come out like a storm moving through, and then I might not write something for 9 months. I have great respect for writers who practice the art of it and have the discipline to come back to the page every single day. I like being around people a tremendous amount, and I think the solitariness of writing is not something that I could sustain.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Great.
It's really, really interesting.
Thank you. It's such an honor. I got to tell you, I mean, growing up, you shot some of my favorite movies of all time. And it wasn't until I went to film school and I really thought about what a DP was that I made the connection that, so much of what made those films things that I adored was in the cinematography. So it's an absolute dream to be able just to share a conversation with you guys. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Right.
Bye.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.